early in the morning, a packed room. Particularly welcome those of you who have traveled long distances to come here. It's always very comforting and very satisfying to see this. I'm often asked, my name is Shakti Sinha, I'm the director here at Teen Murti, NML. I'm often asked, what do you people do at NML? Lots of visitors we get who want for different things. And of course, one, we explained that we have a museum on Nehru, planetarium, we have a library, we have archives, especially our personal papers, etc. And then, of course, the main thing is that we facilitate scholarship, research into issues of basically contemporary India, contemporary relevance. Contemporary, of course, can be defined fairly loosely, thank God for that. And that we have a range of scholars full-time with us, our senior fellows, our junior fellows, and of course those of you who over the years have contributed to the library by coming here, doing your research here and telling us how to make things better. And therefore, when any of our scholars comes up with any good idea to have a conference, a workshop, where you can get ideas from across the world, because generating knowledge is important, generating ideas is important, through research and through interaction. And I think it is in that tradition of Teen Murti that today we are having these forms of knowledge and intellectual traditions in South Asia. We have a full range of speakers and across topics. A friend of mine, she works on gender and violence, Nordic countries, Swati Parashar. She sent me a message, one congratulating me on this, and I sent her the details. But then she added two things which I thought is relevant. One, of course, is that she says, though you say South Asia, it's basically India that you're covering in your this thing. And the other, of course, is that the gendered perspective, the gendered intellectual traditions. And I think that was a valid, very, very valid point to make. But then obviously there are limitations, so I'm not blaming anybody. It's just that whenever you do something, there are always new things that you didn't think of that people do point out. And I think that is something that you should all welcome. Let me not take more time. We have 3 speakers at our inaugural session, the keynote session. The first is the topic itself, I think, is, I was just going to ask Professor Devji, the topic itself is, even without hearing you, you know that this is something that is going to be really interesting. Gandhi against the human race. So let me now request Professor Faisal Devji to kick off our conference. Two things, housekeeping announcement. One, please put your mobiles on silent, off mode. Okay. Second, we are live casting it. So it's on our web page, it's on Facebook Live. So any of your friends who are not here. And third, since we are getting people one by one, I would request those of the younger generation who have strong knees. We have put a dari in front. So if some of you could volunteer and sit here to begin with. So when those of people of not just my generation, but even after me who are not so comfortable sitting on the floor, they would have places to sit. So if any of you would like to volunteer, we have a dari right here. In good Indian tradition, baitho suno, yeah. So with these 3 household announcements, it will be great pleasure to request Professor Faisal Devji to kick off today's.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sinha. I want to thank you, the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, and Amit Suman for organizing this wonderful conference. And I much look forward to hearing all the papers. I'm interested in what happens when humanity, the idea of humanity or the human race, shifts from being an ideal, a regulative ideal, to an empirical reality. What kinds of questions and problems does this shift pose? The shift, of course, happens with new forms of technology and new forms of domination that they create, whether it is statistics, demography, cartography, the possibility of mapping the world and counting all its inhabitants, and then subjecting those inhabitants to policy prescriptions is what in some ways makes the human race possible as an empirical reality and no longer simply an ideal of any kind. Eventually, by the middle of the 20th century, it also becomes possible to think about destroying the human race by man-made means. And the nuclear bomb, of course, is the great symbol for that. In our own day, it's climate change. And this adds another, if you will, dimension to the empirical reality of the human race. Now, one of the questions, there are two kinds of problems that this empiricism poses. One has to do with planetary identification. What does it mean to identify as a human being in this new context? It was all right as long as the human race or humanity was a regulative ideal, because then you could count up the virtues of humanity. Compassion, courage, there could be any number of things. You could distinguish the human from the animal through terms like reasoning or speech. But once humanity is created as an empirical fact, the question of what does it mean to belong to this fact becomes a problem. How do you actually identify with this planetary phenomenon without losing politics altogether? Does humanity become an apolitical or an anti-political category? So these two problems, the problem of identification and the consequent loss of politics, seem to me to structure new questions around this empirical reality that humanity has become. Now, I want to, before moving on to Gandhi, I just want to say a few words about some of the ways in which these two questions were addressed in Europe. So you have, with the Second World War, particularly the emergence of humanity as a negative idea. And I'll mention two figures here, Karl Jaspers, the German philosopher, and then the German-American philosopher or political scientist Hannah Arendt. So Jaspers, in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, gives a radio broadcast which is then published as an essay, a booklet, called The Question of German Guilt. And he's, of course, referring to Nazism and the genocide, the more than one genocide that the Nazis perpetrated. And for him, this cannot simply be a national issue, that is to say, a German issue. It is a global, a universal, and therefore a human issue. That what the Nazis did could never be confined to them, because a whole set of circumstances had to occur in order to make that genocide or those genocides possible, and also the consequences of those genocides were universal in scope. And he came up with this idea of metaphysical guilt, that the guilt for genocide is one that pertains to all of us as human beings. It negates older ideas and ideals of humanity, precisely as the kind of regulative ideal I was mentioning in opening. Hannah Arendt, who was his close friend, takes this idea and pushes it further, and she writes about the shame of being human, that when we look upon such an event, we realize not only the unreality of our former ideals of what it meant to be human, but also, in so doing, can only recover or make real humanity in its negative form as shame. That it's a deep shame we feel for what we, as human beings, have done. It is in that shame that humanity exists in some empirical form. And you see what's happening here, that both for Jaspers and for Arendt, one of the reasons they dwell so much on metaphysical guilt, as Jaspers calls it, or the shame of being human, as Arendt names it, is because this category, while being indubitably real, we all feel that the human race exists, and it exists empirically, nevertheless has no politics of its own, perhaps can have no politics of its own. And this poses a fundamental problem. As long as humanity had remained a mere regulative ideal, it needn't have a politics of its own. It could become part of other kinds of political scenarios. But the moment you can think about the human race empirically and actually alter it by human action, whether it is genocide, the case I'm speaking of here, but also various kinds of technological procedures that are consequent upon statistics, censuses, demography, etc., then it achieves a certain reality, yet one that is below politics. Now, one of the causes for this emergence of empirical humanity that neither Jaspers nor Arendt mentions is colonialism. But this is something that another contemporary thinker, contemporary to them both, also German, this is a triad of Germans, really places front and center in his work is Carl Schmitt, a controversial jurist who, in more than one of his works, actually talks about how humanity becomes a crucial ingredient, a crucial product of imperialism on the one hand, and a crucial ingredient in imperial policies on the other. So, for instance, he talks about the British Empire as a site for the making of humanity in these two senses. How is that? He says, the thing about the British Empire is that it has no contiguity. It has no territorial contiguity. It is spread out across the world. It cannot be conceptualized in any traditional way. Its bulk, its huge size, actually nevertheless reduces its policies to quite narrow geographical or topographical features, such as isthmuses and sea lanes. The Straits of Gibraltar and the Suez Canal are two crucial ones. In order to safeguard the far-flung British Empire, in fact, what you need to do is concentrate on very small spaces, often sea lanes, right? Like the Suez Canal and the Straits of Gibraltar. And we know that in part the Napoleonic Wars, the reason why Trafalgar Square was made in London and Nelson stands on his column there is about guarding the route to India. And because the empire is what it is, dispersed in this manner, both enormous on the one hand and on the other hand, entirely focused on these quite narrow bodies of water, Schmitt argues that the British Empire can only conceptualize its role as a world empire through the figure of humanity. That it acts in the name of the human. It acts in the name of humanity to protect humanity, apparently, and to protect the flourishing of human life. And one of the earliest ways in which this happens is abolitionism, once the British state actually adopts that. So when you abolish slavery, what the British do is they, as you know, impound ships of foreign countries as well, which are suspected of carrying slaves. Right? And they can move beyond the law in the name of the human. And their empire can only be conceptualized in this manner. It cannot be conceptualized in any other way, because there is nothing in common with Australia and India and South Africa and Canada and all of these places. And Schmitt distinguishes this way of thinking from the nascent American empire, which he sees as being defined by the Monroe Doctrine, which is one that literally splits the globe in half into rival hemispheres. There is no topography here, because that line that marks the hemisphere goes through the middle of oceans. So unlike the British Empire, which is dispersed and enormous, but for which focus is always on these narrow bodies of water, and in which humanity has become a kind of key ingredient and a key product of the empire, for America this is not the case. And Schmitt would like the world to move in the American direction rather than in the British direction, though he fears that even the Americans have become anglicized by the end of the First World War. Now, this by way of preliminaries, let me move on to Gandhi, who I think recognizes, certainly more than Arendt and Jaspers, and in some bizarre way, like Schmidt, the imbrication of imperialism and humanitarianism. He understands that humanity is an empirical reality, and as a would-be political idea, say in the British Empire, is entirely attached to colonial rule, which is why, as early as in Swaraj, his manifesto of 1909, he links, when he speaks about humanity, he speaks about it in the chapter on railways, right, on technology, because he understands that it's imperial technology that makes this kind of conception of the human possible. And I'll just quote a little passage from Hind Swaraj. I am so constructed that I can only serve my immediate neighbors, but in my conceit, I pretend to have discovered that I must, with my body, serve every individual in the universe. In thus attempting the impossible, man comes in contact with different natures, different religions, and is utterly confounded. And Gandhi has many such passages where he's very critical of the idea that we should serve humanity. Not that he is not a universal thinker, and I'll come to why he talks like this. So on the one hand, of course, he thinks that this form of humanity is produced in imperialism through new forms of technology, and what it does is it allows for imperial ideology to work through its particular form of universality. And Gandhi himself rejects this, as he rejects the focus on the flourishing of life that excuses and justifies the breaking of the law, which is how the British Empire deploys humanity. So for Gandhi, the human race or humanity has to be derealized. It has to become not a positive reality. He dislikes it as an empirical form, but if you will, a negative one. And Gandhi trades almost entirely with negative categories. Ahimsa, non-violence, non-cooperation. Even brahmacharya, restraint, renunciation. His categories tend to be negative ones. And this is deliberately so. He doesn't like the force that positive categories tend to imply. And for him, humanity is one such category, which in his mind, as in that of Schmidt, is attached entirely to imperialism. Right? So unlike many other anti-colonial thinkers who simply want to, as it were, get rid of the British or any other colonial power, but keep all these ideas, Gandhi thinks that it's the ideas that make us colonized. It's not simply the people. And so we have to overthrow those ideas. And a crucial one among them is the idea of humanity to be protected, preserved, and universalized, and made into an empirical form. Now, one way in which he does that is by rubbishing, if you will, the emphasis on life that defines all humanity, and then on rights, of which, of course, life is the primary one. So in 1937, a henchman of Hitler's, Captain von Strunk, comes to visit Gandhi in Segaon. It's interesting. He's just come from the Spanish Civil War, where he had been in charge of supplying arms to the fascists. And interestingly, he comes to see Gandhi. He's interested in Gandhi's view on health, because, of course, the Germans are also very interested in life forms and in protecting and preserving life. And Gandhi says to him, what I don't understand. So Captain Strunk comes to Gandhi and says, oh, it's too bad, war is terrible. And we should really be interested in protecting and preserving life. And Gandhi says, actually, I quite admire how you conduct war. I dislike the fact that you want to protect and preserve life. And let me quote him. He says, but the West attaches an exaggerated importance to prolonging man's earthly existence. Until the man's last moment on earth, you go on drugging him even by injecting. That, I think, is inconsistent with the recklessness with which they will shed their lives in war. Though I am opposed to war, there is no doubt that war induces reckless courage. Well, without ever having to engage in a war, I want to learn from you the art of throwing away my life for a noble cause. But I do not want that excessive desire of living that Western medicine seems to encourage in man, even at the cost of tenderness for subhuman life. Tenderness for subhuman life, of course, is a reference to vivisection and the killing of animals for medical reasons, for prolonging human life. And in saying this, Gandhi puts his finger on the nub of the issue, that your idea of humanity, which is defined by life and promoted by its flourishing, protection, and preservation, cannot but depend on the violence of depriving others of their lives. Either subhuman beings. It's interesting he uses the word subhuman, given the fact that the Second World War is about to start, in which, of course, Jews and others are defined as subhuman. Gandhi is referring to animals, an insect, every kind of animal life. That by focusing on humanity and the protection and preservation of its life, of human life, you can only render animals fit for extinction, for death, or define other human beings as animals, as subhuman, and kill them. That this ideal of humanity is premised upon violence. It cannot but end in killing others. And so he would not have it. Just as he would not have humanity defined in this manner, so too he is critical of life, which defines humanity as the fundamental right. When you think of rights, of course, the chief one, the primary one, is the right to life. Here too, Gandhi, utterly consistent, says, I will not promote humanity in this way, I cannot promote life in this way, and therefore I cannot promote rights. The three are linked. So again, in 1946, I think, 45, 46, Gandhi receives a letter from Julian Huxley, who is the director of UNESCO, and who is drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for the United Nations. And Gandhi writes back to him. And Huxley has written to many eminent people, Einstein, etc., asking their views. And Gandhi writes back, he's on the train from Sagao again, and he says from the train, Sagao, he writes back saying, I really have not much use for this idea of rights. Rights, he argues, are not inalienable. You say they are inalienable, but in fact, they are guaranteed entirely by the state, and they can be removed by the state. The right to life presumes the death of someone else and the killing of others. The only things that are inalienable and that belong to us as individuals, that cannot be taken away from us by any state, are duties. Duties are what make moral and ethical life, and so it is not life and rights and humanity, those three things that belong together, that Gandhi is interested in, but rather duty. And of course the primary duty, just as the primary right is the right to life, the primary duty is that to death or sacrifice. Sacrifice comes in many forms: non-cooperation, celibacy, civil disobedience, death in the cause of the country or some other ideal. It is only duty in the form of sacrifice that makes moral life possible. So you see what he's doing. What he's doing is he's trying to overturn this, if you will, what he considers an imperial ideology of humanity premised upon life and its flourishing, which he thinks is linked to violence and death, and focusing instead on duties and sacrifice, which, in his view, have greater capacity to protect and preserve life itself. It is only by ignoring life that it may be saved. It is only by making sacrifice and duty your ideal that life inadvertently might be protected, and that you can seek, therefore, to exit from the logic of humanity that has become definitive, in his view, for imperialism. Now, what I want to do in the time left to me is look at some of the ways in which Gandhi finesses and nuances his argument in specifically Indian terms. And he does so, and I'll say something very briefly about all of these things. He does so in part by entering debates that were going on in his time, and that to some degree are still going on, and rethinking them. And there are three debates in particular: conversion, caste, conversion, and cow protection. And I want to say a few words about each of these. So now with caste, of course, Gandhi, there is a great debate going on in this country about Gandhi and caste, and we can talk about it later if you'd like. But for Gandhi, whether he was genuine about it or not, let me leave that issue aside for the moment. He's not interested in caste as hierarchy. He's interested in caste as plurality. So for him, caste, like his idea of the village republic, is about the inherent plurality of Indian society, from which alone can Swaraj come. You could not identify in a colonial situation purely as Indians a situation in which the Indian state is actually run by a foreign power. Swaraj already exists, and it only manifests itself in Indian forms of corporate life, whether the village community or the caste grouping or there are many such forms, linguistic, many other. It's only because we have self-governance and self-rule at that level that we can have it at the Indian level eventually. He's also focusing on caste, like villages, as part of his anti-universalistic vision, which I've described already in his critique of humanity. Right? So for Gandhi, caste is never simply about caste. It's about a much larger set of issues. And for him, and I'll say what he means about caste in terms of this, in the context of humanity. He takes the hereditary structure of caste and its prescriptions and tries to redefine them. Right? So he says, look, a lot of anti-caste figures want to destroy caste, and they want to premise that destruction upon intermarriage and the sort of complete sharing, biological and other forms of sharing. And Gandhi notes that this presumes an idea of humanity that is based on an argument that is the same as a racist argument. What does he mean? What do I mean when I say that? So this idea that we're all going to slough off all our corporate selves, whether caste or religious or whatever it is, and we'll all eat together and intermarry and do all of these things. Of course, those ideas come from a pre-existing idea of humanity, defined in often biological terms. Right? That there's absolute identity, and that identity is premised biologically upon commensality, that we can eat together, upon, if you will, connubial relations, that sexual relations are in common, and upon a certain kind of common language. Right? It is a universalizing way of thinking. And for Gandhi, this idea of identity is puzzling, because it's simply a wider version of a racist form of identity. Racism is also based on these biological premises. Right? We only intermarry with our own kind, we eat with our own kind, and we speak with our own kind. So his question is, how is it possible to think that you're breaking from something deeply hierarchical by nevertheless simply using the same argument, by trying to universalize it? This, he thinks, is also a form of violence. Because after all, claiming sexual and other kinds of rights are also claims in his view of violence. Right? We can perhaps go into it later. Not that he wants to deny any of those things. What he argues is that crucial to thinking about solidarity among human beings is renunciation, not these kinds of rights, and not this form of biological sharing. It cannot be biology. It must be something else. He criticizes biological definitions of solidarity as racist and destructive of moral relations. So he says, let's focus on moral relations. When you look at a family, which we normally take to be the unit of corporate life, we know that actually, apart from one or two of them, a family is defined by non-marriage. Parents and children, brothers and sisters do not have sexual relations. The mother and father do, obviously, but there should be no sexual relations between parents and children or between brothers and sisters. Nor is it possible to think about families as being absolutely transparent, that you understand exactly what is going on. Gandhi in his autobiography says repeatedly about his wife Kasturba, I really never understood her. Even now I don't know if I can guess at what, even his own wife he cannot understand. There is a kind of respect based on, if you will, radical ignorance. That I cannot presume to know everything about the other person, even if she is my wife. So biological relations are not central to family life. Neither is, if you will, language and full understanding. And he even goes so far as to say in Orthodox Vaishnava Gujarati households, people don't even necessarily eat together. Right? That food is also a purely biological determinant and is no way of defining human relations. So he takes these categories of caste, non-commensality, non-conviviality, and if you will, a refusal of language, and rather than using them to justify hierarchy, actually turns them into a critique of a certain kind of idea of humanity. With conversion, proceeding quickly here, this critique of biological non-exchange is replaced by the pluralism of moral and intellectual exchange. So his view is that, and he's one of the earliest thinkers in this manner, who actually, for whom diversity is crucial and a virtue in its own right, where he'll say, look, all of us are imperfect. We can only learn because there are people who are not like us around us. Conversion to one religion in this case is simply a way of of reducing that element, that aspect of mutual learning, and not just mutual learning, if you will, of mutual monitoring. That the role of the individual should be to represent their own religious community in the best way possible, and therefore to act as an example to others and to show up the weaknesses of their fellows. So here too, and in not an unproblematic way, he's taking, if you will, a kind of caste thinking and universalizing it rather than eradicating it. He thinks eradication in the name of a colonial form of humanity is simply a prescription for violence. So rather than eradicating, he actually moves beyond, he thinks, the violence of caste by moving it well beyond the Indian scenario. And so with conversion, he's insistent on this idea of non-speech, that you can only represent your religious group by living its ideals, not by instructing others in them. And he uses this image of flowers and fragrance. So remember, in caste, he's saying, when he's talking about caste, he's talking about the biological, and he criticizes biological relations as being based upon the same logic as racism. Here he's talking about language, also a classical way of defining what is human. And he will say that religion is something like fragrance. If you live it, its fragrance shall spread. He never proscribes religious conversion, but he wants to think about it morally by reducing, as it were, its pseudo-biological imperative, in this case, instruction and language. So let me move to cow protection. Another great debate of his time and of ours. So for Gandhi, cow protection is important because it really shows up the limits of humanity, of a certain kind of idea of humanity. Important about it is that it allows for solidarity between species, but also a kind of solidarity that moves beyond. So it links back to what I was saying about caste and family, because of course cow protection is only possible because of non-sharing. You do not obviously have commensal relations with the cow. You cannot have connubial relations, nor can you speak to the cow. So all of those things that Gandhi was actually privileging with regards to the family are manifested in the relationship of human beings and animals. And for him, the cow simply represents non-human life in general. And there is an Indian history, of course, and a religious history to cow protection, but that doesn't make it a purely Indian matter. For him, it's a universal matter. So the thing about cow protection, which for Gandhi is extraordinary, is that it allows us to move beyond species being. It allows us to move beyond our species without identification. So you're not claiming that you are like the cow or the cow is like you. You're not claiming that kind of identity that an imperial vision of humanity presumes or presupposes. What you're doing is thinking about a set of relations with a living being. Prani is what the term that Gandhi usually uses for this kind of life. Right? Not pashu, not janwar, prani, right? A sentient being. The kind of relations you can have with this being can serve as a model for your relations more generally. So rather than making your relations with the animal, rather than modeling your relations with the animal upon your relations with other human beings, he does the reverse. He thinks your relations with the animal should serve as a model for your relations with other human beings. Because your relations with the animal are not premised upon sharing either of food or of obviously sexual relations or indeed of language. That your ethics cannot be based on these. That the attempt to universalize these biological and pseudo-biological relations through identity. You are like me because I can talk to you, we speak the same language. You are like me because I can eat with you. You are like me because I can have sexual biological relations with you. Remember that all for Gandhi is the same way in which racism is promulgated. Whereas interspecies relations cannot do this. So the point about cow protection, and there are many points that he makes, these are the ones I want to focus on here, is that it actually exits. It allows Gandhi finally, and in the most effective way, to exit what he considers an imperial form of humanity. And he calls this humanitarianism. What is humanitarian is cow protection. Why? Because for the first time, it forces the human beyond itself, without identification. You cannot identify with the cow. It therefore allows the human to move beyond the racist logic of itself and to consider moral relations on foundations which are not identitarian. And for them, for him, that is absolutely crucial. Now, I will end by small examples. I've given you examples for the other issues. You know, during the Khilafat movement in 1919, this is the centenary. Right? Gandhi, the Khilafat movement after the First World War, when the Ottoman Caliphate is defeated, and Muslim clerics come to Gandhi and ask him to take over this movement in favor of the Caliph. Here is the first and largest pan-Islamist movement. It is led by a Hindu. No one has any complaints about it. It's an extraordinary thing when you think about it. And it is really led by a Hindu. Gandhi is its leader. At that time, both Hindu and Muslim leaders come to Gandhi and say, let's make this a basis of a deal. We will make a deal between Hindus and Muslims. And Gandhi says, on no account. The nation and nationalism is not, it cannot be based upon a contract, which is a commercial transaction that only lasts while its conditions last. It can only become possible on the basis of duty and sacrifice, which presumes love and not rights. If Hindus think that the Muslim cause is justified, they will support the Muslim cause without identifying with it. You don't have to believe in the Caliph in order to support your neighbor. If Muslims think that Hindu support is crucial to them, without any contractual relationship, they will abjure cow slaughter. Not because they believe in the sacredness of the cow. They don't need to believe in it. It is precisely the fact that these two things, the cow and the Caliph, are not identical, and that you don't have to believe in them, that makes them comparable for Gandhi. So he says, the Caliph, after all, is nothing but the Muslim cow. By contrast, the cow is nothing but the Hindu Caliph. Now, notice what has he done. He's made solidarity possible without these kinds of exchanges that I've been talking about. Right? In this case, contractual exchange, but all the other exchanges as well, the exchanges of food or connubium or anything else, even language in a way. There can be mutual solidarity without using the same language. Hindus do not have to talk about the Caliph, but they do not need to believe in it. Similarly with Muslims. It is only, as it were, this way of universalizing what I'm calling caste logic, by holding these two things apart, that they can actually become comparable. The cow and the Caliph can become comparable precisely because they do not share anything. Precisely because identity is not involved. And that is what makes cow protection too possible. And as we know, during the Khilafat movement, Muslims did indeed abjure cow slaughter. And Hindus did indeed support the Khilafat movement. So it was a great experiment. Gandhi's thoughts are never just Gandhi's thoughts. They're always put into action in some way. And I wanted to end with Khilafat, not only because this is its centenary, but also because it actually shows us how any number of things can come together. These great disputes and debates which continue into our own time over conversion, etc., and caste and cow protection, over religion. And someone like Gandhi was capable of, as it were, separating them out and putting them back together again through a completely different set of relations and by a completely different logic. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lots and lots of food for thought. And I think one of the primary ideas, title itself, forms of knowledge and traditions, when you talk about Gandhi is explaining that it's ideas which colonize us, and therefore it's ideas that ultimately you have to address. And of course, the fact that if you treat each other as a prani, then obviously the whole relationship changes. And I think there was a very strong driving force in Gandhi's explanations, which is why he was very comfortable with plurality, very comfortable with non-identitarianism. Of course, this is not without risk. When the Khilafat movement started, Jinnah was the first one to protest very strongly, as the book that Jinnah felt that introducing religion, as a point of view, was possibly the wrong thing to do. And that 1928 Pune, it was a very serious physical things. But I think you've really set us on the very good fact that we need to address these ideas and really look at them very carefully. Because ultimately, whether we like it or not, whether you understand it or not, it's ideas which really drive a lot of things that we do. And here's the thing of prolonging human life. There's this lovely American physician, writer of Indian extraction, who wrote this book about his grandfather dying at peace at home in Pune, and his father dying in a hospital in America with tube lights and tubes into his body. And how, in that sense, was dehumanizing this prolonging of life unnecessarily to the medical sciences. I should have introduced a bit of Professor Devji, but just he's professor of Indian history and director of the Asian Studies Center at the University of Oxford. He had faculty positions all over the New School in New York, Yale, Chicago, Harvard. Many books. This one is Impossible India, Gandhi and the Temptation of Violence, amongst other books. And he has a PhD from the University of Chicago. Our next speaker, Professor Nita Kumar, welcome. Also, I see a PhD from the University of Chicago, right? She is the Brown Family Professor, South Asian History at the Claremont McKenna College in California, Claremont. She's again, as I said, been a PhD from Chicago, started her academic career in Delhi University. She's been at Michigan, Reed College, Nirman, where I think you're still associated with Nirman in Varanasi, Brandeis, Yale, Brown, Chicago, lots of things. And I was mentioning before you came that we are possibly missing some of the gender perspective, and I see that you have worked. So your topic is the quote-unquote hidden curriculum of knowledge and intellectual transmission in South Asia, the home-school relationship in the 19th and 20th century. So I now request Mr. Kumar.
Sorry. I have to first say how pleased I am to be here. Thank you very much for the conference and for inviting me. I have, over my intellectual career, which, as Professor Sinha pointed out, did include Delhi University and JNU, where I did my MPhil, I have had many opportunities to present my work here at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. And in fact, the 35 or such years of working on education has seen many, many points at which I tested out my ideas among an audience such as this. So I'm so very happy to be here once again. And actually even more so because this time I didn't have to take on the responsibility for the topic. And it magically appeared to be one of those very topics that I'm extremely interested in, passionately interested in, and have been working on. So thanks to the organizers and to Amit particularly for a very interesting write-up as a conference proposal. So I want to begin by saying that explaining my choice of this term, hidden curriculum, since the conference abstract itself asks what is knowledge. I want to just emphasize that knowledge is not supposedly what is transmitted through a curriculum, although many people expand that to include all kinds of informal learning and forms of knowledge. I want to actually emphasize that there are many other sites of learning and knowledge transmission that historians and other scholars have to take very, very seriously, and that are actually well known to other kinds of scholars, such as anthropologists or folklorists or historians of religion. And I'm very interested in these other sites, such as the family, such as language learning, such as early childhood and mothering, and including the arts and performances, and neighborhoods and villages and city spaces. These, according to me, are sites where knowledge is produced and transmitted. But since it is not necessarily recognized as that and is not ever called curriculum, I'm using the very handy and very evocative term which is used in education literature called hidden curriculum to try to get at that. It's not just hidden curriculum, it's much more than that. There's much more power and meaning and a multi-vocality to it, which I shall try to suggest to you. So with that prelude, let me begin by giving you a kind of panoramic view of what I consider to have been going on in the 19th, 20th centuries with the consolidation of colonial-style education and learning and curriculum. And since there were many, many, many types of people, groups, communities, localities, and regions that we could talk about, I want to make clear that even though I've worked on artisans and merchants and working classes and women and so on, Sanskrit Pandits and so on, and all that is published and many times over, I want to, in order to reach this broad spectrum of people here, talk about a more national level of intelligentsia, which will be in common. People like Gandhi and many others, names that are known to everyone and familiar. So the first point I want to make, and I'll describe this in two narratives. That's what I want to call them. The two narratives are those of what is, in familiar terms, of what is known as indigenous education. That's the first one. And by that I mean what the processes are of learning and transmission by which this intelligentsia gets formed. So the subject formation of the intelligentsia itself in various sites of learning. And the second narrative is what I call that of nationalist education. And that's when the new educated elite take on the mantle of forming a new nation and of producing many kinds of changes for their future in the country. And that is, so the second phase, a different narrative, but the very people who are produced by a certain kind of learning and knowledge are now the ones who are in the position of formulating and producing something which they think is the new territory of knowledge and how to transmit that. So these are the two narratives. Let's begin with the first one. The formulation that I find very, very important and useful is to, and because the conference proposal did ask for some kind of theorization, I would not ordinarily always whip up the name of Michel Foucault, but I think it's very useful here to do that because Foucault talks so directly of the formation of a new kind of subject in Europe, a modern subject. And there are many who take on a Foucauldian kind of method and apply it to the colonial situation, thereby missing that actually what happened in India was that that new kind of subject did not emerge. Historian Sanjay Seth has a book called Subject Lessons, in which he makes this very argument that colonial education failed to make Indians the kind of subjects that it was designed to produce. And he claims that they were, he makes a very interesting claim. He says that they were already plural subjects and they could not be refashioned into the kind of mono subjects and European kind of subjects which colonial education could have been seen to be aimed at producing. And so the kind of transformation in the subject that occurred in Europe simply did not occur in India. I have many differences with Seth also, and I use different lines of reasoning, amongst which one is that it is not such a great, let's say, agonizing kind of question as he presents it. It's not even something for which one needs to apologize. One just has to actually look around oneself and see the countless histories, narratives, and constant processes of subject formation that are going on all the time, and in none of them is the European subject replicated. So there is obviously a different kind of modernity, history, and subject formation in India than the one described by Foucault. I call it a pluralistic process and a plural education, which is what the intelligentsia received. So all over the 19th and 20th centuries, even while the new educated person was being actually formed through 10 plus, 15 plus sometimes years of schooling, college and university life in a colonial type of institution, followed by a professional life of a colonial molded new professional workspace and technology. Even while all that was happening, this person was also undergoing a different, alternative, parallel, simultaneous education elsewhere. And that's where the home comes in. I have elsewhere talked about many of these processes that go on at home. Here I'm going to focus just on one, mention, not even focus, the one which I call language learning. But apart from language learning, there is mothering, not through the biological mother necessarily, through surrogate mothers or mother figures, but the kind of, let's say, socialization that is generally known as mothering. There is that. There is other kinds of ethical, sometimes vocational teaching in the home and in the family. There is the learning of narratives, of epics, of myths, of local histories, and of genres, of all kinds of literature, philosophy, and so on. In short, there is a bunch of things that are known as epistemology, ontology, ethics, morals, social hierarchy, and of course mythology, which constitutes the content of what people learned at home, even while they were pursuing a curriculum that had none of all of this in their formal schools. Just to mention a few random names among the intellectual elite, Bankim Chandra, born in 1838, learned Sanskrit as a child. Kali Prasanna Singh, born 1841, learned Bengali and Sanskrit in his childhood. U.V. Swaminath Iyer, born 1855, began learning Tamil and Sanskrit at 7 or 8. Pandit Ayodhyaнаth, born 1840, studied Arabic and Persian as a child. Surendranath Banerjee, born 1848, learned Bengali and Sanskrit as a child. Kashinath Tribang Telang, born 1850, learned Marathi and Sanskrit. Shankaran Nayan learned Sanskrit. Motilal Nehru read only Arabic and Persian as a child. So all these people not only seriously learned their mother tongues, but they also learned a classical Indian language, Sanskrit, Arabic, Persian, or a combination of them. Some learned it very seriously in a very formal, programmatic way. Others learned it in a slightly different way. But the point is that their introduction to their languages was very early on in a very formative period of their lives. Why is this important? This is important because a language is not merely just a language. A language is a discourse. It's a culture. It's a form of power. It's a form of meaning. It opens up worlds and universes which are not necessarily accessible otherwise. And a whole lot of other literature just on language learning shows that the kind of impression that languages create when they are taught at a very early age, literally, from birth up to the ages of 6, 7, or 8, creates certain permanent changes in the mind through which other forms of thinking and comprehension and analysis and debate are possible, which are close to the mind if other languages are not learned. So a language, through its grammar and epistemology and so on, can do things very powerfully that other processes can't. I don't think we have taken this language learning seriously enough. Indeed, I would even say as an activist that here is part of the solution. If you want to have some form of cultural continuity, if you want to still make sure that certain very important, let's say, epistemological and knowledge areas are not getting lost in your society, then all you have to do to make sure of that is first make sure of the transmission of the languages of that society. The reason why this kind of parallel learning was done was twofold. I think it can be shown that in the first phase, the earlier phase of the 1830s and 40s and so on, it was done in a non-reflexive and non-discursive way. It was the carryover of the style of social reproduction by which the desire of the generation to replicate itself in the next generation was being done. And at that time, English had been introduced, but it was looked upon as purely a technical thing, something that you learned in order to get a job. It was not understood as being transformative in any other way. But once that understanding occurred, that it was not merely a game that you could play successfully, but that there could be results from the learning of English which were not foreseen by the adults concerned, and that the child could actually get transformed in unforeseen ways. After that, it became a much more deliberate and ideological effort on the part of the educated classes to make sure that this language learning was taking place. There is a lot of evidence for this. I'm not sure that it has anywhere near been tapped, but there are piles and piles of the journals produced by different caste associations, of which I've just tapped into a few, like those produced in the region of UP, in eastern UP, particularly by Gujaratis and Khatris and Marwadis and Yadavs and Jats, and I could go on with the list of them. And in each of them, there is this agonizing and this self-questioning as to what they are losing, the idea that there is something very important in their identity which is going to get lost if they do not take technical steps to make sure that that loss does not occur. So that's the germ of a nationalism that is occurring there, and the vision is very blurred. People don't understand exactly how it's occurring. They grasp at it. They try to hint at various processes that they may have observed or overheard. They do think that English has a huge role to play in it, but they're not completely sure how it does succeed in its denationalization, as they call it, mission. So it succeeds somehow in transforming people to distance themselves from their culture, their history, their tradition, and the masses of their country. But how precisely a language does that is a bit elusive. So the solution, therefore, is also a bit blurred, and we'll come to that in a minute. So apart from language, of course, there's the whole corpus of stories and narratives that are being transmitted in early childhood. And most of all, I mean, the way that this whole world of discovery was opened up to me was when I was trying to simply understand how the epics and the stories associated with the Ramayana and the Mahabharata were ever learnt at all and were used so successfully by a lot of the new educated people who would never have encountered them in their schools. And then the obvious answer appeared that, of course, they had overheard all this, not even deliberately ever been taught that, because that doesn't happen in different kinds of Hindu households, but they had just seen them performed or narrated or had heard them at the periphery. And one has only to look at oneself, literally, in order to understand that, yeah, that's what was going on. So this process is very difficult to pin down historiographically, and there's always the danger of it seeming something very soft and very quasi-spiritual and, something that you are making the mistake of ferreting out some authentic pre-colonial situation. But if you can be freed of all those doubts and problematizations and just look historiographically at the question of what exactly was being taught when these new educated people wrote their memoirs and mentioned in always too short a space, a few paragraphs or pages, that, oh, their mother used to tell them stories all the time. Now, what were these stories and how are they relevant to the formation of the individual? But think of this, especially in the metropolises of Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras. Almost every new educated person who then went on to become a well-established and celebrated professional, usually as a judge or a lawyer, but often in one of the other professions, either after retirement or upon taking early retirement, then curved back, as it were, to the early childhood point and learned further those languages, rediscovered those languages, studied those epics, pursued all those myths and treatises and texts which they had merely heard about, and then that learning had been broken by the colonial educational school. I love most of all the example of Aurobindo Ghosh. If I may quickly just remind you of what happened in his life, you must have all heard of the fact that he was one of those who was sent off as soon, literally, as he was ready for school, to a convent school, first in Darjeeling, and then he was sent off to England, because his father was very clear that there should be no trace of Bengaliness in the boy, and he should grow up to be as English an individual as he could possibly be produced. And so he was, but only up to the age of 17 or 18. After which, I think he was at Oxford, but at one of these places, he was exposed to burgeoning politics, nationalist politics, and after not succeeding in the ICS, he comes back to India and starts a very, very focused study of all the things that he thought he needed to know and he had missed. And where on earth could he have got that idea from, if it was not in the first literally 6 years of his life, which are documented as being spent in the lap of his mother, learning his Bengali and learning all those stories and narratives which she must have told him. And those were, of course, germane to the final product of, no one is, born completely as an adult, being able to pick up things and reads them. It has to be somehow linked and continuous with something very deep down in the past. So these narratives should be taken seriously, even if they're not a steady stream, but merely trickles all over the place, and they're all family-based, so it's all very interesting, fascinating, local family history that we are talking about. But they should be taken as a historical challenge, as how to integrate into an understanding of what home-based education has been all over the 19th century and continued into the 20th century, without which we are actually going to lose out on any kind of a possible statement, leave-aside theorization of Indian knowledge and traditional intellectual systems. Let's move on to my second narrative of nationalist education. And here I want to mention the case of Surendranath Banerjee, born in 1848. He, when he was about 30 years old, thundered, "We are an astute people. We are not as wholly devoid of sagacity and common sense as some others take us to be. With our fathers, with the astuteness characteristic of our race, saw that England's greatness was to some extent at least due to her noble literature, to the immortal truths taught by her science, and to the sublime morality which breathes through the burning words of her great writers and thinkers. Might not Bengal freely grope about in the same direction under the same guidance?" This is Surendranath Banerjee at 30. On the occasion of the inauguration of Banaras Hindu University, when he was 70 years old, this is what he said. "We who have profited by experience are not going to make such mistakes. In our curriculum, Hindu ethics and metaphysics will occupy a foremost place, the Western system being used only for purposes of contrast or illustration. Special attention will be paid to a knowledge of the country, its literature, its history, and its philosophy." So in the course of his life, Surendranath Banerjee replicates what's going on in the course of the nationalist history of India, the familiar transitions from the moderate to the extremist to the Gandhian phases. And in each of these phases, we must make sure to give credit where it's due. Even in the earliest ones, there was a recognition of what India was losing and what it needed to retain and somehow put into place with the new kind, even with the new kind of schools that the British were institutionalizing. But much more than that, in the next phase, so in the first one, there are many bodies which are formed and people who call themselves the new Jesuits and agents of change. The new English schools are formed, new education societies. They all have new in the title and very often English or some evocation to England. But in the next one, their distinguishing characteristic is a total resistance to working within the system and the preference to step out of it and to find alternatives. So there's boycott, of course, of government schools and so on, but there is a much more constructive process which is going on, in which, again, just a few names will be enough to give you the picture, like Dayanand Saraswati's, the Vedic, Anglo-Vedic schools, starting from 1880s, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan's, going on to 1920, and, of course, Annie Besant, with her deliberate intention of setting up some kind of synthesis of the Hindu slash spiritual and the Western slash scientific, the Hindu schools that she set up. Rabindranath Tagore, and I would include Gandhi here also, because there's a Vidyapeeth in Banaras set up in his name. There were even more radical examples of gurukuls in which there was the effort to replicate this kind of studying in the kul or family of the guru. Now, in all these cases, the idea was very, very powerful. The politics of the nationalists regarding a new education for India has always been head-on. The question then that should arise is that with all these efforts at various kinds of nationalist-inspired schools, in each one of this, the idea is very specifically anti-colonial, and further, the constructive idea is to make a synthesis between the East and the West, the Indian and the European, the past and the present, religion and science. You know, no matter what you try and what you say and what you do, you cannot overcome or go beyond that desire for a synthesis. There has to be that, and they were all trying it in different ways. So if their politics was so strong and correct and appropriate, why would there not have come into being a viable Indian system of education, which it didn't? I mean, right up to the present, there have been many modifications, many nice changes and important reconsiderations, but the curriculum has not changed. And here again I come back to the idea of a hidden curriculum. And I'll summarize quickly the 2 or 3 reasons for what I'm calling the failure, putting it in inverted commas, because success or failure in education is impossible to decide upon, and it all depends on what you're looking for. So the first reason would be that the intelligentsia did not understand their own formation. They did not see how they had become what they had. They could not see the technology in the processes by which they were formed. And they, in their effort to set up schools, which they all set up somewhere or the other, some in their villages, native villages, some as a chain everywhere, some directly directed at women, girls, and so on. In those efforts, they did not, therefore, replicate what had happened with themselves. Since they did not deconstruct it, they did not analyze it, and they did not comprehend it. So in their own case, there was a family support. There was a lot of work done by the family. The family had actually produced them finally into what they were. And the colonial schooling was only part of the story. So that hidden curriculum, which went into their formation, was not taken seriously by them. So the schools they set up actually had sometimes very nice buildings and endowments, very skilled teachers, but they did not perform their job because they remained till the end of the day a kind of second-rate replication of what elite schooling really was. Elite schooling was a perfect and very, very smooth functioning of the family-school relationship. And what they tried to put into place was some kind of a different alchemy, not really with the resulting magic that occurred with themselves, of combining what they thought was Indian languages or Indian spirituality, sometimes called Indian culture, sometimes religion, into, or the arts for that matter, into the existing colonial curriculum. So it was just add and mix, add and mix. And right from the beginning, those new subjects were marginalized. No one took them seriously. They were considered add-ons to what was really important, which was all the science and so on that was needed to score in the exams. So this is kind of what I call a gap in technology, when the politics may be correct, but the technology is very weak. And so there is the desire to reproduce something or to create a new kind of Indian or to have a new kind of schooling is fine. But how exactly that has to be translated in the classroom is never really accomplished. And of course, one major reason, which is a very commonly understood one, it applies to gender, it applies to children in general, is that the pursuit of anti-colonialism and independence and so on took so much energy and sucked all the energy and space out of any other endeavor, whether it be for women, children, or education, that even the best of the ideologues was not really an educator finally, as much as they were a nationalist who was working for some other goal. Quickly again, then the fact remains that these new educated elite were the elite. They came from already established professional, sometimes landowning classes, sometimes just a few generations old. I'm not saying they were, like Mughal grandees or legatees, but that positioning worked to make them feel that their own education, which had been so successful, was enough of a justification in itself, and they ceased to have empathy with those who did not have the same kind of results, forgetting that it was not about the education, it was about a kind of social positioning that they already had. And finally, together with this is a less tangible thing, which is that we have to admit that the hidden curriculum of colonial schools and colonial education must have been so powerful, which is also understudied yet, that it managed to form these new educated Indians to believe that actually there was some kind of an essential difference between them and the masses, which is what the British believed and what they wanted to believe. So this racist idea of the British was translated into a very fuzzy idea for educated Indians, where education itself was the marker of distance of an essential kind between themselves and those who did not have that education.
Thank you. And one of the markers which continues today is, we look for vocational education in India, and we train motor mechanics in ITIs. And actually, if you go to any mechanics workshop, all the mechanics are those who joined it as a teenager and learnt it from their ustads, So, but in our system, we don't recognize them as being trained because they don't form part of our formal system. So for us, they remain untrained, but actually they're far better and far more. Because the sites for learning are so many, and for those of us who work in the field of education, administering education in India, once you strip away all the other factors, the most predictable cause of good learning outcomes for young children is not the school but the home. Those who come from educated homes with their mother educated, that child will normally has much higher learning outcomes than those who come from. But we again tend to discount these factors that we find nebulous. We don't find them very, very, easy to explain. Yes, you were very good to point out all this learning of Indian languages was considered so important that Radha Ram Mohan Roy, to become a good scholar in his own right and a good vakil in his own right, traveled from Calcutta to Patna to learn Arabic and Farsi. Because in those days, if you didn't know Arabic and Farsi, of course he knew English from before, but he learned Arabic and Farsi after knowing English, and not the other way around that you would assume normally. So it's the fact that in that sense we have lost out on many traditions, intellectual traditions, learning traditions which ran through these different languages across the country. And here's the power of ideas, and therefore when times change very quickly, or we think changes are too fast, there is a feeling of loss of identity. And of course, back with colonialism, denationalization does happen. And very good young Goan scholar in the I can't remember which year, Francis Louis Gomes, wrote this thing called the denationalization of Goans. How with the colonial impact and conversion to Christianity and the banning of Konkani language and making Portuguese compulsory, this complete break happens in society. And when you have such loss of identity, again a backlash at certain stages. So 30-year-old Sandranath Banerjee has a different point of view from a 70-year-old Sandranath Banerjee. I think lots of very fascinating things, and why the new education, the Nai Talim, the Kashi Vidyapeeth, the Gujarat Vidyapeeth, Shantiniketan itself, PHU. Reaction to Aligarh was Jamia Millia Islamia. End of the day, they all ending up becoming clones of each other and did not really able to evolve their own very different intellectual traditions. Our third speaker, Professor Dinesh Singh, to me he is an eminent mathematician. He was also the Vice Chancellor of Delhi University, been all over the world, has been honors everywhere in the world, taught everywhere. And now though he'll be speaking on learning from the past, lessons from the past, is very strongly focused on using the new mediums for education, for educational transmission, breaking out of the traditional classrooms. I'll leave it at that. Dinesh, I request you to.
Thank you. Thank you, Shakti. I'm delighted to be here, and it's been a good and great learning experience listening to the two distinguished speakers who have preceded me. And in many ways, I could make my task really easy by just uttering a single sentence that I concur with what they have said, and I have nothing more to say. I also feel a little bit like a pigeon amongst the cats. This is not my area of learning, and it is just something that has interested me over time. And I have nothing original to say. These are expository ideas that I have gathered, but they may be of some interest to at least some of the young ones here. So I'm quite sort of fascinated by the intellectual traditions of India dating back to ancient times. You know, the Rig Veda in many ways is considered a sort of fountainhead of many traditions, intellectual practices, and even knowledge systems in India. And what fascinates me about the Rig Veda is one of its opening stanzas, not the first one, but pretty much at the beginning, Ano Bhadra Kritavo Yantu Vishvata. Let noble ideas come to us from every direction. I think that sets the tone for intellectual traditions of India. It is such a monumental idea. Let everything that is good be imbibed. Let us grow with that. And over the ages, all the great and wise ones that have been here on this soil have almost said the same thing in their own way, ending with Gandhi. There were others after Gandhi too, but I'd like to sort of draw up my line over there. And you know, the Rig Veda has many other facets to it. To my mind, I consider it the first MOOC. It embodies such great ideas, and through an oral tradition, without dilution in quality, it manages to manifest itself in the psyche of the entire subcontinent. There is no dilution. The Rig Veda, as it is practiced in Kerala, is no different, and not from today, from times ancient, from the Rig Veda that was practiced in Kashmir or Banaras or other parts of India. That is a tribute to the way these ideas were collected, created over time, and the manner in which they were expounded. And I have always mentioned this whenever I speak at any event where MOOCs and distance learning and things like that are discussed, that the thing should be, you must have substance, and form can be added to it in different ways, and it will survive and do good. But these days I notice there is more form and less of substance when we talk of technology and stuff like that. But there were so many things that the Rig Veda engendered, but let me just speak of the Upanishads, the intellectual tradition that comes to us from the Upanishads. There is so much there. We just heard Neetaji speak about homeschooling and schooling in general. You know, in the Chandogya Upanishad, there is this marvelous story, and these are recordings of historical beings, the great gurus. The story of Satyakam, who goes to the Gurukul of Haridrumat, and at age 12. So that was the tradition in India. You did not really try and enter a formal school till you had reached a certain maturity. Prior to that, you were taken care of at home. And by the way, Neetaji, I would like to add that, you know, education through language is one form, but there are other kinds of education that happen when you're really happily being schooled at home, including sport. I mean, I really believe, I do not claim to be a wise man, please don't get that impression. I'm happily married and I know I'm not wise therefore. But just this business of indulging in physical activity is a huge experience in education. Somewhere, the Indian tradition has always emphasized this. Now in modern times, we have lost it. Language and mother and stuff is also very great. But physical activity, physical recreation is also a huge experience in education. Leave that aside. So Satyakam turns up at the Gurukul of Haridrumat and seeks entry. And Haridrumat tells him that child, we only admit Brahmins. What is your lineage? And Satyakam tells him that I asked this question of my mother before I set forth for your Gurukul. And my mother said that I've worked as a maid in many homes. Many men have taken advantage of me. And I have no idea who your father is. I have christened you Satyakam. My name is Jabala. Proclaim yourself proudly as Satyakam, the son of Jabala, the maid. And then Haridrumat responds. ये भारत की परंपरा है, इसको हृदय में उतार लो. What does Haridrumat say? Child, I admit you, for that is the hallmark of a Brahman. Not by birth, but by adherence to the truth is one called a Brahman. You are a true Brahman, I admit you. That is the great tradition of India. And what does he do then? There is this huge learning. We've thronged to Western institutions of learning, particularly for business management, etc. In those times, wealth was measured in terms of the number of head of cattle that you owned. That's where your prosperity comes from. If you look at the Mahabharata, Duryodhan goes to seize head of cattle in the Virat kingdom. Cattle was your measure of wealth. What does Haridrumat do? He doesn't tell Satyakam, go recite the Vedas. He gives him 400 head of cattle. And he says, go into the forest and do not return until they have multiplied to 1,000. Think about this. This is a lesson in wealth management. It's a hands-on project, a real-world situation. Those are the lessons and intellectual traditions we must imbibe from India's past. And Satyakam sets forth obediently and does not return until they have multiplied 1,000 to 1,000. When he does, Haridrumat proclaims again that I see enlightenment on your face. Who taught you? There is so much learning in here. He narrates what really happened with him, how he did what he did. And yet in the end, look at also his humility. He says, sir, I am not yet enlightened. You need to enlighten me. That is the Indian tradition, goes all the way up to Kabir and beyond. Jab main tha tab hari nahi, ab hari hai jab main nahi. This humility that I will never be really enlightened. It's a lifelong process. Those are the intellectual traditions of India. And speaking of the Upanishads, they embody such marvelous thought. Yet somewhere in our modern forms of curriculum, in so many ways, not in our schools of business management, not in our schools of learning in other systems, we have not really taken them into account the way we should have. The story of Rik with the cart driver. He's a wise man, and the king hears of him, that he is a wise man, and the king seeks his wisdom, sends his prime minister, sends a retinue of officials, and Rik says, I'm not interested. I do not wish to enlighten the king. The king goes himself with a huge entourage, and Rik still refuses. Eventually the king comes back and he thinks, why does he say no to me? And it strikes him. Knowledge only comes when pride leaves. You have to make room for pride, for knowledge, by getting rid of your ego, your pride. So he now goes barefoot as a commoner. And in humility he seeks his wisdom and knowledge, and Rik agrees. There is so much learning, and that is the tradition. I keep repeating this. That is the Indian tradition. Do you know that amongst the people who really influenced Mahatma Gandhi, and I'm again addressing the young, as I said, I feel like a pigeon amongst the cats with the seniors here, but I can get away with the young, So, Gandhi was deeply influenced by the transcendentalists, people of the Concord movement, the Concordists, Emerson, Thoreau, Ruskin, Carlyle, all of them. When he writes to Roosevelt seeking help for India's freedom struggle, he writes specifically how much he was influenced by Emerson. And when I delved into the transcendentalists, look at when Shakti said the power of ideas. Look at the power of the ideas. You know, the transcendentalists were deeply influenced by Upanishadic thought. Emerson introduces the Bhagavad Gita to Thoreau, and Thoreau keeps the Gita by his bedside all the time. And Thoreau influences Gandhi through his ideas on civil disobedience and Walden. And look at how these ideas have transcended. From the Upanishads, they go across, crossing all tyrannies of geography and reach the transcendentalists. And then they come back to feed Gandhi. And their story doesn't end. When Gandhi is visited by a delegation of American blacks just before India achieved freedom, and when he hears of their plight and he begins to understand the situation, here is what he foretells. He says, it may well be that the message of non-violence will reach the rest of the world through the American blacks. In this delegation of American blacks is a man who teaches, in whose class is Martin Luther King. He comes back and speaks of Gandhi. And King is influenced by Gandhi's ideas on civil disobedience. And that story doesn't end there. It just goes to Nelson Mandela. And hopefully this will go on, this back and forth. But that is part of the Indian tradition. To send forth good ideas and to receive good ideas. And you know, this also gets embodied in what we call the essence of the Upanishads, the text, the Bhagavad Gita. I will just quote two things from the Bhagavad Gita. And I'm not espousing any religion. Do not get me wrong. I have no desire, and the Gita and what I will quote from the Gita will also reinforce that. Sri Krishna, when he talks to Arjuna about what is worship, he says so clearly, just as all rivers fall into the same ocean, all forms of worship lead to the same God. He doesn't even say they come to me. He says they lead to the same God. Look at the liberalism of the whole thing. And the other thing, when he says what is the hallmark of a true yogi, he says there is oneness of existence that the yogi must see. A true yogi makes no distinction. This is categorically written in the Bhagavad Gita. Makes no distinction between a Brahman rich with learning, a cow, an elephant, a dog, or an eater of dogs. Do you see that? He equates them all, make no distinction. The oneness of existence. And Bhagwan Buddha, Bhagwan Mahavir, Guru, Nanak, Kabir, all of them say the same thing in their own way. All of them. That is the essence of the Indian tradition. And to forever seek, but do not seek just simply by becoming a hermit. Seek actively. Again, the Gita repeatedly emphasizes that even if you choose not to act, your heart will consistently be working, consistently be acting, and you cannot escape karma. Therefore, get into the world of karma. Be active. That is the Indian tradition. And the story just goes on. It doesn't end. You know, when the Upanishads and the Rig Veda was being practiced, and it isn't just philosophical thought that I'm talking about. When they were being practiced, other forms of knowledge grew around them. My own realm is mathematics, so I'm a little more familiar with this. So a whole bunch of mathematical texts came around the time the Rig Veda was being practiced in India. They're called the Shulva Sutras. Shulva, literally translated, as little as I understand Sanskrit, means a piece of cord or string. And a sutra is a formula or an aphorism connected with the use of the string. What it really means is these are mathematical ideas, formulae, insights that have come at construction sites. Construction sites for Vedic fire sacrifice altars, where the construction happens through a dead weight attached to a piece of string. Something that when you go to a construction site today, you will see the masons still using that dead weight with a piece of string. Those are the mathematical formula. Amongst them, in the Shulva Sutra of Bodhayan, who is conservatively estimated to have been around 800 BC, and I will say a little bit about dating also, in Bodhayan Shulva Sutra is so clearly enunciated the theorem of Pythagoras. So clearly enunciated over there. And he gives a construction from which you can derive a modern day proof. There are other Shulva Sutras that succeed Bodhayan. They also talk of the theorem of Pythagoras. They talk of other things. I just chose the theorem of Pythagoras because no matter how much you try and avoid mathematics, and I know there are people from history and such disciplines who tend not to like mathematics, Pythagoras' theorem is well known and taught, I presume, in the 9th grade, so you will all be familiar with that. And I'm not trying to say anything about credit, but there is strong evidence that Pythagoras came to India. Voltaire records in his writings that there is little doubt that he went to the banks of the Ganga to learn from the Brahmins. And you know, I traveled all the way to Indore and Ujjain, and I asked them, because there are lots of people in Indic studies there, traditional Indian studies, that do you think he came to India? And they ask me quizzically, they look at me and say, what do you mean, do I think? It's well known. He came here, he was deeply influenced by Jain philosophy, became a vegetarian, would eat his evening meal before sundown. They accept it as a matter of fact. Did he steal the theorem of Bodhayan? I have no comments on that, but there was a huge flow of knowledge from India to the parts of Western world through the Arab world, both through the sea route and otherwise. And so, let me say a little bit about dating. I came across a book on ancient India, authored 200 years ago by the then Vice Chancellor of the University of Edinburgh, the name of Robertson. It's a marvelous book. Largely, it is based on Greek and Latin sources, and he constructs his vision of what he thought was ancient India through that. But there's one chapter in that book in which he talks of a manuscript in Sanskrit that he has come across from the Karnataka region of India. It's a reading of the night sky, and because it is on astronomy, he enlists the support and cooperation of the professor of mathematics at Edinburgh. This is 200 years ago. Together they decipher the manuscript and they establish many startling things. This is something that is very, very important. I feel somewhere I urge my colleagues from history to take a closer look at that. So they first established that it is, mathematically they established that it is actually a reading of the night sky on the date that they mention it is. It's an accurate date. There is no fudging there. And what is that date? It is 5,000 years ago. He records it in that book. And by the way, Robertson was one of the most eminent historians of his time in Great Britain. And what else does he say? The mathematics professor tells him that the mathematics that has been used to come to that reading, that mathematics requires spherical trigonometry. Just think about this. 5,000 years ago, they talk of spherical trigonometry being used in India. And they mention it as a matter of fact, in passing. It's not that they are going to dwell on that. Their purpose is to go on to the things that the manuscript says about the night sky and astronomy. But they mention this in passing. You know, this could have bearing on even dating the Rig Veda. Because the mathematics that came at the time of the Rig Veda, as embodied in the Shulva Sutras, is of very magnificent nature, but certainly far less sophisticated than spherical trigonometry. To reach from the kind of geometry that they talk of in the Shulva Sutras to spherical trigonometry in those times will take you at least 1,000 years. And so, this certainly has come, spherical trigonometry, after the time of the Rig Veda. I want you to think about this. I am not making any categorical statements, no assertions, but I want the young at least to dwell on this to see how you could possibly use this in dating the Rig Veda. But leave that aside, you know. I want you to know that when Alexander came to India, was it around 500 BC or 300 BC? Okay. And what many people do not know, but I have come to this through the folk traditions of history in India. I'm sure the historians here would know it better than I do. That, you know, he did not cross the Beas. His spies had went across the Beas and came back to tell him that the powerful Magadhan army with 50,000 elephants is assembled across, and Magadhan soldiers are eager to give him battle, and that I bet you demoralized Alexander enough to return. And when he was returning, he had already made friends with Porus, Puru. And Porus gave him 100 talents of steel ingots, whatever they are. I don't know how they were manufactured, what shape they had, but he gives them 100 talents. Talent was a measure of weight. And Alexander is really happy with that. Why? Because that comes from the famous Wood's steel of India. For centuries, this Wood's steel, the famous Damascene sword, the sword of Damascus, was nothing but the use of Wood's steel from India crafted into a sword in Damascus. And those swords were better than any sword in any part of the world. They were in great demand. And this tradition of the Wood's steel continued all the way up to the time of Michael Faraday, who in his experiments with electricity would insist upon having components of the Wood's steel from India. Alas, that tradition seems to have been lost. I asked the head of Tata Steel a few days ago if he had any idea of how wood steel was being made, and he hadn't even heard of it. This is not to run him down, don't get me wrong. But I wish we would be a little more aware of what it really was and how we could see means of reconstructing it or bringing it into our systems of knowledge, particularly in engineering. And do you know, it was a huge export item. And people would complain that things like this from India, because we were a knowledge economy, were being exported and they were draining away the gold of the West. Consistently. I don't know if the young know this. It is said often that India discovered or invented plastic surgery. That is a fact. And where did I pick this up from? Johns Hopkins University, not from any institution in India. They also told me, and these are recordings and writings of scholars there, that India invented cataract surgery both before the time of the Christ. Both before the time of the Christ. Now, to perform such surgery, you require implements and instruments, surgical instruments of a very fine order and nature. We were so advanced in metallurgy that they showed me descriptions and images of the instruments that are mentioned in these texts of ancient India, where Wood's steel was being used. And all of this was being exported. I also learned about this from the writings of Alexander Nemirovsky, the Russian historian. But I did not find much in Indian texts, modern texts. And that was bringing in wealth to India. There was other means of wealth being brought to India. Knowledge systems were being put to use for practical purposes. Do you know, when Isaac Newton proclaims to the British Parliament that at this point in time, science knows no means of determining position at sea, Indian knowledge systems had figured out how to determine your position at sea. They had an instrument called the Rapalgai or Kamal. And our ships used to sail across all the way to the African coast without any problems by use of this instrument. So they could determine latitude and longitude. The Europeans were clueless at that time, and their ships would repeatedly get lost or sink because they would run afoul of bad places, bad weather, stuff like that. There is an island near the African coast called Socotra. On that island, caves have been discovered, and on the walls of those caves are scrawlings, etchings of Indian sailors dating back to the time of the Christ in the Brahmi script. They write their stories. These are the recordings of history. So our ships traveled across in those times. When I was a child, I was told that Vasco da Gama discovered the sea route to India. What I learned from a distinguished professor of history from Portugal, a lady who told me that he actually just picked up an Indian navigator in Africa who brought him straight to Calicut, crossed the entire Indian Ocean. And that navigator also did not do anything unique. For hundreds of years, Indian ships were doing that. We had mastered the 7 seas. But that tradition has also been present in other forms of knowledge. So what was it? What was the intellectual tradition? What was the tradition of knowledge in India, which made us a knowledge economy? Do you know Vallabhi, an ancient university, probably was the first university in the world to admit women? Think about this. Princeton University, till I know this from who was at that time the president of Princeton University, who made Princeton what it is, that till the 60s they were not admitting women. Think about that. The intellectual traditions of India, the knowledge systems of India. Vallabhi used to admit women then. Also, Aryabhat was a professor at Nalanda University in the 5th century. Aryabhat, in his monumental work, records so clearly that the earth is spherical in nature. And he gives us many essential parts of the Copernican theory, much, much before Copernicus. And if you think that Aryabhat was accepted by everyone, that is not true. There are many of his contemporaries who say that he is very good at mathematics, he is good at this, but we do not agree with his theories about the earth. But he writes so clearly. He says, he describes the earth as a sphere. He says, Kadamba ke pushp ki tarah gol hai. Spherical like the kernel of the Kadamba flower. Not only that, Aryabhat does many other astounding things. He is a great mathematician. He puts Indian astronomy onto a firm mathematical footing. And at age 21, he is made a professor in Nalanda. They don't burn him at the stake. That is the Indian intellectual tradition. This business of, even though we don't agree with some things, we acknowledge his originality, we make him a professor. And there are other things that go on. I do not know how many of you are aware of this. But 200 years before the Christ, in the realm of prosody, so by the way, in the Indian intellectual tradition, you had to be good in a transdisciplinary fashion. You had to. You had to be really good. So in prosody, there is this man called Pingal, who is trying to create new meters. And in trying to create new meters, he invents a mathematical device which he calls the Meru Prasthar, steps leading to the mountain top. And do you know this was rediscovered in Europe in the 18th century by Pascal? It is known now in the Western world and generally in the world as Pascal's triangle. This comes out of Sanskrit prosody in India 200 years before the Christ. And this tradition is not a one-off incident. Halayut in the 12th century is writing a commentary on Pingal's work, and while writing on Pingal's work, commenting on Pascal's triangle, he discovers the binomial theorem much, much before Newton discovered it. So on and so forth. But you know that I once attended, about 30 years ago, a lecture by a distinguished nutrition scientist in India who came from the National Institute of Nutrition in Hyderabad. His essential training had been in the West, but he was really well versed in Sanskrit. And that lecture was embedded in my mind from that time. And 2 days ago, because of this event today, I accessed that lecture. Because I'll tell you something startling. There are many things in that lecture, many things about ancient India and our knowledge systems, about Ayurveda. He says that there is an ancient text much before the invention of the microscope, where the shape of the red blood corpuscle is clearly described. You have to think about that. These are texts, and this is a distinguished scientist whose doctorate comes from a really well-known institution from the West, professor at the National Institute of Nutrition in Hyderabad, who says this in the lecture. I accessed the lecture 2 days ago. It quotes the text. It says it describes the shape of the red blood corpuscle. But I don't know if you're aware of this. You know, I have always held an abiding interest as simply a layperson in the Ayurveda. And there are many marvelous things. The Indian system of medicine was so scientific. So, you know, I once went to see a practitioner who was really a hermit, and he used to avoid meeting people. He would live in a hermitage in a remote part of Madhya Pradesh. And I traveled all the way because I had personal knowledge of what he was. And I went with my parents because my father had experienced him and drawn benefit from him as a young man through his Ayurvedic knowledge. And you know, he made me stand in the sun and he looked at me through a prism and he diagnosed some of my problems. More importantly, my mother had a tiny hole in her heart. Nobody knew, you could not tell by looking at her. He made my mother stand in the sun, looked at her through the prism, and he said, "You have a hole in your heart." You know, he told me there's nothing magical in the prism. He says it's a science, an ancient science. And he also told me that this particular prism he got from Germany. He says now they make the best prisms. And that was the science of Ayurveda. And he told me something else. He mentioned another Ayurvedic practitioner who lived near Banaras, who had developed, who understood the Ayurvedic tradition of creating oxides of mercury, with which he said he used to regularly cure ailments like tuberculosis and cancer. And he told me that knowledge in North India certainly is completely lost, because he was the last of the great ones who knew how to create non-toxic oxides of mercury. At that point in time, my mother told me that a close relation of his, much before the invention of streptomycin, had come down with a terminal case of tuberculosis of the lungs. And when there was no hope, he went all the way to see this Ayurvedic practitioner who cured him through the oxide of mercury. And this relative of my mother was a chain smoker for the rest of his life and died of old age. And he had tuberculosis, almost terminal stage of the lungs. But that knowledge seems to be lost, and in our modern systems of knowledge, we don't even talk about these things, don't even want to discuss them. I came across such miraculous surgical cures which exist even today at the Tibia College of Delhi University, which is now in such neglect. And I have been urging government to try and do something to salvage that knowledge. I hope one of you here will do something somewhere whenever you get the opportunity. Let me just try and finish. The story is endless, and I'm not going to take more of your time. But you know, the calculus is regarded as one of the finest inventions of the human mind, and generally it is ascribed to Newton and Leibniz in the Western world. In the 12th century AD, Bhaskaracharya discovered the calculus. It is there in his writings so clearly. He looks at the function sine. Because why did Bhaskaracharya discover the calculus? Because he was looking at planetary motion. He was looking at planetary motion. And he wanted to figure out how to determine velocity at any instant of time. You know the phrase he uses for that? Tatkalik gati. Velocity at an instant of time. This is the exact word that Newton uses in his calculus. Instantaneous velocity. And Bhaskaracharya establishes the rules of differential calculus right there, 500 years before Newton. And the tradition of the calculus continues undiminished, uninterrupted for all these years in southern parts of India. By then, North India had begun to fall apart in the intellectual manner, in the intellectual traditions. But in southern India, things still were preserved, and the calculus and much of what Europe discovers much later was all embodied finally in the Kerala school of mathematics. Many of the great ideas of the calculus, 200 years before Europe discovered them, are all there in the Kerala school. I'll give you just one name, Madhavacharya. There were many, Nilkant, so many of them. And do you know that in the 16th century, when the Portuguese established a foothold in Kerala, they set up systems of education, and Catholic priests from Portugal came and they picked up Malayalam and they picked up Sanskrit. And they translated many of our texts of knowledge, good for them. And I am convinced that amongst other things that they transmitted, they also transmitted the ideas of the calculus to the West. I'm not the only one who thinks like this. There are many mathematicians now. I have been shouting myself hoarse for the last 40 years. When I was really young, I've spoken all across the world, and I have never been challenged in my ideas. These are matters of history. Just a few months ago, I visited Ujjain again. And I went to a museum where they host a bunch of ancient manuscripts. There are 14 manuscripts that are commentaries just after the time of Bhaskaracharya on Bhaskaracharya's work. And I asked the curator of that museum, has anyone ever looked at these 14 manuscripts? Have they ever looked at this? Have they ever tried to understand? Has anyone translated? He says they have been lying here untouched for time immemorial. I wish somewhere we could gain some insight. And I do not wish to dwell on the past for chauvinistic reasons. I want them so that we gain more confidence and sometimes good insights. There was a manuscript there that I came across, really ancient, probably in the Brahmi script, on veterinary medicine. There was so much there, and it's just a small museum. God, there must be so many things in so many places. So I want you to understand that that is the tradition of India. We were a knowledge society, and as Angus Madison records, and he relies on a fair amount of hard data from the 1st century till about the 18th century, that India dominated the world's economy, global GDP. somewhere our share was something like 23%, way ahead of China. And why was that? Because our knowledge systems were in tune with the needs and requirements of society. What was it that drove us? What was this intellectual tradition? This openness of mind, this liberalism, this tolerance, this acceptance that even if the other man is wrong, there are other good things about him, let us have him. And transdisciplinarity connected to the real world in a hands-on manner. And that's what made India what it was. Somewhere we need to reinvent or rediscover or recreate and embed these learnings from the past to our advantage in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. You have at the point that lots and lots of stuff available have not really been analyzed and looked at and talk about intellectual traditions and transmission of knowledge. I mentioned that Raja Ram Mohan Roy traveled to Patna to learn Bengali and,
Arabic.
Farsi and Arabic. Recently the writer, and I'm not criticizing him, Guru Charan Das had to learn Sanskrit. He went to Chicago to learn Sanskrit. So obviously there is a lots within our system that is not really working to the optimal level. And there's lots and lots of, I think, of introspection. But introspection based again on inward and outward. It's not just looking inward, but also looking at what the others have done, how they've done it, what is it. Because the strength of a tradition is its ability to keep reinventing itself. A tradition which does not, and Tagore has lovely lines on that, I won't recite it. You don't want to get lost in the dreary sands of time. You want the tradition to be always being relevant and always reinventing itself. And in that sense, dynamism and openness is what really counts. We've had three very fascinating and very different topics, discussions being put forward to you. I'm so glad to see so many young people here. We've never had such a big crowd for such a long time. Swami, thank you very much for the efforts. Excellent job done. We'll now break for tea break of 10 minutes and reconvene at... can we do the questions over tea? Huh? Let's do the questions over tea.